How do you survive when the world freezes over and you are just a speck of dust on the map of history, doomed to struggle with winter and death itself? Have you ever wondered what it's like to face winter, knowing that every day can be not just difficult, but truly the last? We, spoilt by 21st century civilization, are used to invisible comforts. Central heating that gives comfort at the touch of a button, endless supermarket shelves bursting with food at any time of the year, safe, lighted streets, and medicine that can work wonders. But what if your home is a leaky, windswept hut with freezing cold seeping through the cracks? What if the food is a meager ration earned by hard work and given to a feudal lord, and the main entertainment is not countless hours in front of the screen, but watching your own children shiver from the cold, and their breath turns into tiny clouds of steam? Get ready to plunge into a world where survival was not a right, but a cruel daily art, and every breath a struggle, where defeat meant not just discomfort, but a real, painful death from hunger, cold, or illness. Watch this video until the end of the NCA, and you will learn not just dry facts from the history textbook, but shocking, bone-chilling details of the life of a medieval English peasant, which will forever change your understanding of the past and make you take a fresh look at what we have today. For the medieval peasant, winter is not just a change of season, it is a merciless, cruel executioner whose bony hand reaches out for every soul. It's not the cold air, but the chilling fear of starvation that looks right into your eyes from every corner. Most of the population lived on the absolute edge of survival, and even the most insignificant, crop failure or loss of livestock could turn into not just a lack of food, but a real mass catastrophe. In the fiercest, most merciless winters, when the scanty summer supplies were running out and the implacable feudal lord still demanded his share, the peasants were so desperate that they lost their human form. Historical records and archaeological finds show truly horrific practices. There are cases when people were forced to eat leather from shoes and belts, tree bark, roots of wild plants, and even just grass. These products caused terrible abdominal pain, digestive disorders, and only prolonged the agony. The body, devoid of protein and fat, slowly faded. Muscles atrophied, skin cracked from beriberi, and hair fell out. But the most terrible thing was that in times of extreme despair, when there were no alternatives left, they resorted to feeding on the corpses of animals that had died from diseases, which in itself was the source of new epidemics. Anthrax, swine fever, glanders. The meat of these animals decomposing became a deadly poison, but hunger drowned out the instinct of self-preservation, and in the most horrific and documented cases even, with the bodies of dead people, committing an act of cannibalism. This was not a sadistic act, but a last-ditch, desperate attempt to survive, transcending all moral barriers when human dignity was replaced by the bestial instinct of self-preservation. The peasants' daily diet was extremely poor and monotonous. The basis was cereals, barley, rye, oats, less often wheat. Oats, less. They were used to bake black, heavy bread that was coarse and often contained impurities such as sand or small stones from millstones, which led to rapid wear of teeth. Bread could be baked once a week or even less often, and by the end of the week it was stale to the state of stone. Grain was also used to make chowder and porridge, thick, nutritious dishes that were the only source of carbohydrates. They added everything that was at hand: dried herbs, roots, sometimes tiny pieces of vegetables if they were preserved. Fresh vegetables were absolutely rare in winter. The surplus of the autumn harvest cabbage, turnips, onions was fermented or stored in cellars, but they quickly deteriorated. Fruit appeared on the table only in the form of dried apples or pears, if any were available. Protein was deficient. Meat was such a rare and valuable delicacy that its taste was remembered only for a short time after the autumn slaughter of cattle. And it, of course, ended catastrophically quickly, leaving only a terrible void. This was most often pork, which was prepared in the fall, and it was quickly eaten or spoiled. Chicken meat and eggs were also a luxury, because in winter the chickens laid poorly, and there was nothing to feed them. Fish, if the farmer lived near a river or lake, could be a source of protein, but it was not always available to everyone. The diet was critically unbalanced, which led to constant malnutrition, vitamin and mineral deficiencies, weakening the immune system and making farmers vulnerable to any disease. Children, the elderly, and pregnant women suffered the most, and their mortality was particularly high. Psychologically, the constant fear of hunger created unbearable tension. Every crumb of food was worth its weight in gold, and any accident, even the smallest, with the harvest or cattle, was perceived as a personal tragedy that could destroy the whole family. The peasants lived in a state of chronic stress that undermined their mental health. This led to apathy, depression, and sometimes outbursts of insanity. The moral choice between survival and humanity left deep, unhealed wounds on the soul. Stories of cannibalism, though rare, were passed down by word of mouth, serving as a terrible reminder of what a desperate man can do. These stories sowed panic and distrust, even if the person had never experienced it directly. What do you think was more terrible for a medieval peasant in such a bleak winter? The unbearable, maddening torments of hunger, or the moral choice that life itself put them in front of, forcing them to step over all human principles of survival? If you are ready to find out how they coped with this chilling horror and what consequences it had for their psyche and society, watch this video to the end. The answers will amaze you. Preparing food for the winter was not just a chore, but a sacred ritual full of danger and hope, which was supposed to ensure the family's survival until the next harvest. Vegetables such as cabbage, turnips, and root vegetables were fermented in huge wooden vats and barrels in an attempt to preserve them longer. Brine was used for this purpose, but the effectiveness depended on the quality of water and the cleanliness of dishes. Some vegetables could be dried, but this method required time and good conditions for drying, which was not always available. Meat, pork, beef, and more, rarely lamb, was slaughtered in the fall, when the animals were gaining weight, and stored, smoked over the hearth, or salted abundantly. But here was the main problem and source of constant fear. Salt was an incredibly, fantastically expensive commodity, literally worth its weight in gold. Shipping salt from coastal regions or salt mines to the interior of the country was difficult and expensive, making it inaccessible to most farmers. Its scarcity or high price meant that farmers could not afford enough salt to effectively preserve all their meat. This led to the fact that huge volumes of harvested meat spoiled or rotted right in the cellars, turning from a food source into a source of poisoning and new diseases, such as botulism or food poisoning, which often led to death. The smell of rotting meat was common in poor homes, but hunger forced people to ignore this warning signal. Even the grain that was stored in barns and bins built of wood and clay was under constant threat. Rodents, rats, and mice destroyed up to a third, or even half of the crop. Mold and dampness, especially in poorly ventilated storage areas, led to spoilage of grain, making it unsuitable for food or sowing. The losses were enormous, and this negated all the hard work of the summer. Farmers tried to fight the rodents with the help of cats, but they were not enough to solve the problem. In addition, the grain often contained impurities of weeds, which reduced its nutritional value. If the year was poor, due to droughts, heavy rains, or pest infestations, farmers were faced with a terrible choice: eat their scanty supplies and starve to death in the spring, with no seeds to plant again, or sell or slaughter their last, scrawny animals to pay back the Lord's exorbitant taxes and feudal duties, effectively signing a prigivore. This choice was agonizing, as it meant guaranteed death, but sometimes it was the only way to avoid even more severe punishment from the feudal lord. The main source of heat in the peasant house, an open hearth located most often right in the middle of the earthen floor, was not a symbol of comfort, but a constant threat, slowly killing all the inhabitants. It was a primitive bonfire, over which a cauldron was suspended for cooking. The smoke, without a proper chimney or hood, filled the entire tiny space of the hut, soaking the walls, clothing, and lungs of the occupants. This turned the air into a thick, suffocating haze, causing chronic coughing, irreversible lung diseases such as bronchitis, pneumonia, emphysema, and even silicosis due to the constant inhalation of smoke and soot particles. Farmers' eyes were constantly watery and burning, and constant irritation led to chronic conjunctivitis, corneal ulcers, and even complete or partial blindness in old age. In order to make some use of each precious warmth, people slept in the same room with their pets, pigs, chickens, sometimes even cows, to make some use of their body heat and keep warm. The smell of animals, their waste, the constant presence of insects, all this was an integral part of their life. At night, when the cold was bone-chilling and the overall temperature in the hut rarely rose above a few degrees Celsius, children often slept not just in their beds, but under them, on straw mats, huddled together or with animals, sharing the last remnants of warmth. This not only provided them with minimal comfort, but also protected them from drafts that penetrated through the cracks in the walls and doors. Frostbite on the fingers and toes, as well as other exposed areas of the body, was common, especially during sleep when the body was not moving. These frostbites left behind ugly scars, chronic pain, and sometimes resulted in the loss of limbs due to gangrene, making the peasant an invalid and a burden to the family. Firewood was the only fuel, and harvesting it required a huge amount of effort throughout the summer and fall. The peasants cut down trees in the surrounding forests, if the feudal lord allowed, collected firewood and dead wood. But even with the availability of firewood, heating without stopping was a luxury that was not available to everyone. Fuel was saved, and the hearth often burned only a few hours a day, mostly for cooking. The rest of the time, the house was bitterly cold. The walls of the huts, made of wicker branches covered with clay and straw, the so-called wattle and daub, poorly kept warm and constantly let in cold air. The floors were dirt, damp and cold, which contributed to the development of rheumatism and arthritis. The constant cold, damp, and smoke were slow but sure killers, reducing the life expectancy of the peasants and making their lives unbearably difficult. Clothing for the medieval peasant was not just a wardrobe item, it was a second skin, a vital protective shell. But at what a price! They were coarse, scratchy, unpainted fabrics made from wool obtained from their own sheep and flax grown in their own fields. Women spun threads on spindles in the endless winter evenings, then wove cloth on primitive hand looms. This laborious process was an integral part of their daily lives, requiring great patience and skill. Every thread, every stitch was put in with the understanding that these clothes should serve faithfully for many years to come. They couldn't afford the luxury of having multiple sets of outfits, so each item of clothing was worth its weight in gold. This garment was worn until it was completely worn out, darned and resewn dozens or even hundreds of times until only fragments of the original fabric remained, barely resembling its former form. Imagine, the same shirt or tunic could have been worn for years, decades, passed down from older children to younger ones, or even from parents to children. It was not just a symbol of frugality, but rather a reflection of extreme need. Worn-out sleeves were shortened, holes were sewn with coarse threads, and patches were layered one on top of another, creating a kind of mosaic of different shades and textures. Such multi-layering was not a fashion trend, but a necessity in order to somehow preserve heat and extend the product's service life. It was filled with the odors of hearth smoke, unwashed sweat, animals, dampness and rot, an unimaginable mixture of scents that would seem unbearable to a modern person. These odors were so strong and corrosive that they permeated not only the clothes, but also the hair, skin, and even the very dwelling of Cresta Ioannina. They washed it very rarely, in cold water, often without soap, which was a rare luxury available only to a few. The lack of regular washing and hygiene made clothing, and therefore humans, a permanent breeding ground for lice, fleas, ticks, and scabies. These parasites were not just an unpleasant addition, but a real living army that constantly accompanied each peasant, causing unbearable itching, skin infections, open wounds from scratching and spreading diseases. They literally swarmed in the folds of clothing, in the hair and on the body, making the life of a medieval person a constant battle with an invisible enemy. In addition to the physical discomfort, the constant presence of parasites exerted serious psychological pressure. Constant itching and irritation were a source of insomnia, chronic fatigue, and general loss of energy. In such conditions, it was even more difficult to focus on hard peasant labor. How could they get rid of these fellow travelers when even primitive soap was a luxury and there was no hot water enough for washing and bathing? The answer to this question is shocking in its cruelty. Most simply, put up with it, considering it an inevitable evil. Sometimes primitive methods of combing out parasites with a comb or even calcining clothes over a fire were used, risking burning them to ashes. This was a desperate but often useless method, as the parasites quickly returned from the environment. Infusions of herbs with insecticidal properties were also used to control lice, but their effectiveness was extremely low. Sometimes the clothes were frozen, hoping that the low temperatures would kill the parasites, but this also gave only a temporary effect. Their lack of knowledge about germs and hygiene principles led them to a constant battle in which the winter was always an army of parasites. Clothing was not only a protection from the cold and bad weather, but also an indicator of social status. Although the peasants did not have luxurious outfits, even small differences in the quality of fabric or the availability of simple embroidery could indicate a certain gradation within the peasant class. However, in general, their clothing was a symbol of their hard lot and constant struggle for survival. Personal hygiene in the Middle Ages was not just at a low level, it was practically non-existent, especially in the winter months when cold water and lack of heating made washing a real challenge. They washed very rarely, often using only a small amount of cold water without soap, which was extremely expensive and available only to the rich classes. Most people might never have had a full bath in their entire lives. It was a common practice to simply wipe your face and hands with a damp cloth, and your body would remain unwashed for months or even years. The lack of sewers and waste disposal systems meant that open latrines and piles of animal and human excrement right on the streets and near houses were the absolute norm. This turned the settlements into fetid hotbeds of infection. The city streets were literally littered with garbage, food waste, manure, and human feces, creating an unbearable, unsanitary environment. The rains eroded this waste, spreading it throughout the territory, polluting drinking water sources and contributing to the spread of diseases. Forget toothbrushes and deodorants. The unpleasant, pungent smell was an integral part of everyday life and was taken for granted. People of that time were so used to these smells that they simply stopped noticing them. Teeth were not brushed, which led to widespread caries, gum disease, and early tooth loss. Bad breath was the norm, and there was no remedy for it. In such unsanitary conditions, instead of real methods of fighting diseases, people relied on superstitions, amulets, and magic rites, which of course were absolutely useless against such terrible diseases as plague, smallpox, dysentery, and typhoid. They believed that diseases were caused by evil spirits, corruption, or curses, and not by dirt and germs, which they did not yet know existed. Various herbal infusions, fumigating rooms with smoke from certain plants, wearing talismans made of animal bones or stones, and reciting prayers and spells were used to protect against diseases. At the same time, no real preventive measures such as washing hands or boiling water were taken. Moreover, some hygiene rituals were even harmful. For example, it was believed that hot water opens the pores and makes a person vulnerable to diseases, so they preferred to wash in cold water or avoid water procedures altogether. Washing your hair was also a rare occurrence, which led to a massive spread of lice. The lack of toilets in the modern sense led to the fact that people relieved themselves wherever they had to, in the fields, in ditches, right behind the houses. In cities, rich residents could have primitive latrines or use chamber pots, the contents of which were then simply poured out into the street. In general, hygiene in the Middle Ages was so primitive that a modern person, once in those conditions, would be shocked and, most likely, very quickly fall ill. It was a world where filth and disease were an integral part of everyday life, and the fight against them was reduced to superstition and despair. Winter was not just a cold season, but a time of mass deaths, especially for farmers. Colds, flu, pneumonia, tuberculosis. For them, these were not just diseases, but a virtually guaranteed sentence to a slow and painful death. Low temperatures, lack of adequate heating in their homes, poor nutrition, and chronic malnutrition weakened their immune systems, making them extremely vulnerable to any infection. Lack of antibiotics, basic knowledge of anatomy and hygiene, and primitive methods of treatment based on bloodletting, which often weakened the patient and worsened his condition, or herbs turned any, even the most banal infection into a lottery with a fatal outcome. Many people died from a common cold, which today is treated in a few days. The Black Death that raged in the 14th century was the worst disaster in the history of Europe, wiping out up to half of the continent's population. Farmers who lived in crowded, unsanitary conditions, in close contact with animals and with each other, were its first and most numerous victims. The plague was spreading at a terrifying rate, and people were completely helpless before it. They did not understand the causes of its occurrence and the ways of transmission, which led to panic, mass fleas, and even more spread of the disease. Entire villages died out, fields were left uncultivated, and famine became another scourge. They believed that diseases were God's punishment, the machinations of the devil, or evil eye, which prevented them from looking for real methods of fighting. This plunged them into fatalism and despair. Instead of trying to understand the nature of diseases, people turned to the church, prayed, organized penitential processions, and flagellated themselves in the hope of God's mercy. Medical knowledge was extremely low. Doctors, if they were available at all in rural areas, were guided by the outdated theories of Hippocrates and Galen, relying on the doctrine of the four fluids, humors in the body and their balance. Diagnosis was primitive, and treatment often consisted of attempts to release bad fluids from the body, which as a rule only worsened the patient's condition. Mental health also suffered. Constant stress, hunger, grueling work, fear of death, and the realization of helplessness in the face of illness led to mental disorders, deep depression, hallucinations, and even insanity. People lived in constant expectation of death, which could overtake them at any moment. There were frequent cases of mass psychosis when entire communities believed in curses, saw signs of the apocalypse, or fell into religious ecstasy. Child mortality was astronomical, and the loss of several children in one family was common, which also left a heavy imprint on the psyche of parents. The life of a medieval peasant was a series of incessant trials where every day was a struggle for survival and death was always at your back. Despite the bitter cold and short daylight hours, the farmer's work never stopped for a minute. He was not just a worker, but an absolute slave of the land and his feudal lord. His whole life was subject to the cycle of agricultural work and the requirements of the seigneur. The peasant not only cultivated his meager allotment to feed his family, this was his main, but far from the only source of concern. He had to work his way through corvée days of forced unpaid labor on his master's land, even if his own land screamed for help, demanding urgent attention. It could be labor in the Lord's fields, in the gardens, in the barnyard, in the woods, or even in the smithy of a feudal lord. The volume of corvée varied from region to region, but on average it could range from a few days a week to several weeks a year, which left the peasant with very little time to work for himself. In winter, when agricultural work in the field was impossible, corvée acquired other forms. This could include repairing the estate, cutting wood for the owner's needs, which was especially difficult in frosty weather, weaving baskets, repairing fences or buildings, cleaning the premises, as well as harvesting firewood and fodder for the seigneur's livestock. The main, sole purpose of this labor was to produce something that could be given to the Lord as a debt or tax, whether it was products, handicrafts, or services. Sometimes peasants were involved in the construction or repair of roads, bridges, and other infrastructure facilities that the feudal lord needed. This work was particularly grueling, as it was often necessary to work without sufficient food and in conditions of extreme cold, which led to frostbite, injuries, and illnesses. To give up corvée meant not just punishment, but starvation for the whole family, deprivation of land, and complete expulsion from the community, a fate equivalent to death in those times. The peasant was chained to the land and the Lord almost completely, without the right to free movement or choice of profession. His children inherited his status and his debts, falling into the same vicious cycle of dependency. The feudal lord had the right to judge the peasants, impose fines on them, and sometimes apply physical punishments for failure to act or poor performance. This system kept the peasants in constant fear and submission. They were forced to put up with injustice, since any attempt to resist could lead to complete ruin and death of the entire family. In addition to corvée, the peasant was subject to numerous taxes and taxes. He paid for the use of the mill, the furnace, the lord's vineyard, the right to graze cattle on the common pastures, and the passage through the seigneur's domain. Often there was a head tax, which was paid simply for the right to live on the lord's land. All these payments were ruinous and left the peasant with only a minimum for survival. He lived in constant fear of crop failures, diseases, or wars that might deprive him of the latter. The work of the peasant was extremely inefficient by modern standards. Primitive tools, wooden plow, hoe, sickle, lack of knowledge about crop rotation and fertilizers, dependence on weather conditions made the crop extremely unstable. Famine was a frequent visitor to their homes, especially during periods of crop failure or harsh winters. All this created a deep sense of hopelessness and fatalism among the peasants. They perceived their lives as a continuous series of trials destined for them by fate or God. This heavy share was passed down from generation to generation, leaving no hope of change. The long, piercingly dark winter evenings were a time when farmers gathered around the dim firelight that was the only source of warmth and illumination in their modest homes. It was a time for the storytelling, transmission of oral traditions, ancient myths, and local legends that formed the basis of their cultural heritage. Children sat on the floor by the fire, listening with wide eyes to stories about heroes, fairy tale creatures, and events of the distant past that helped them understand the world around them. These evenings were also an ideal time for learning. The older ones taught the younger ones practical skills such as basket weaving, mending tools, or basic weaving right by the fire. They sang songs often sad and lingering, reflecting their difficult life, but sometimes funny, helping to forget about the hardships and fill the house with at least a little joy. They exchanged news and gossip from the surrounding villages, which was the only source of information about the outside world. It was a kind of evening news that was passed from mouth to mouth. Sometimes they played simple games such as board games with chips made from pebbles or pieces of wood, riddles or word games that didn't require any special equipment or skills. These meetings were the only outlet in their monotonous and hard life, allowing them to forget about hunger and cold for a while. It was a time when the family came together to support each other and relax a little after a grueling day. Despite the constant difficulties, the peasants tried to find moments to spend time together, strengthening family ties. But what did they do when the last embers were extinguished and complete darkness enveloped the hut, only occasionally interrupted by the glimmer of the moon or stars through the cracks in the walls? In primitive dwellings, often one-roomed, where several generations, parents, children, and sometimes the elderly huddled under one roof, the lack of any privacy was the norm. Everyone slept side by side to keep warm, snuggled up to each other. In such a cramped environment, in total darkness, the peasants, exhausted by hunger and hard work, kept warm only by snuggling up to each other. The warmth of a hug and physical intimacy was an important way to keep warm on cold winter nights. The relationship between spouses was built on mutual assistance, shared grief, and joint work, because each family member was an indispensable link in the struggle for survival. Emotions and personal desires were relegated to the background in the face of everyday struggles. Attachment between spouses certainly existed, but it was built more on practical necessity and support than on romantic feelings in the modern sense. The life of medieval peasants was steeped in the struggle for existence, and even personal relationships were subject to this harsh rule. However, it was in these moments of shared closeness and mutual support that they found the strength to continue living. Children in the Middle Ages were not children in the modern, protected sense. From a very young age, they were considered small adults and began to work actively together with the whole family as soon as they learned to walk. This was due to the need for survival. Every pair of hands counted. Winter was a particularly dangerous, deadly time for infants and toddlers. According to some estimates, up to half of them did not live to see their first birthday due to cold, diseases such as pneumonia, dysentery, smallpox, poor nutrition, and complete lack of hygiene. Even those who survived the first year often suffered from rickets, beriberi, and other diseases caused by malnutrition. It was a ruthless, natural selection process where only the strongest survived. Surviving children learned crafts and survival skills right from the cradle, watching their parents and imitating them. The girls helped around the house, cleaned, cooked the simplest food, spun threads, wove, and took care of their younger siblings, who often had to be nursed from infancy. They also helped out in the field during the harvest, picking up the remaining ears of corn. Boys took care of cattle, grazed sheep and cows, helped in the field during plowing and sowing, prepared firewood in the forest, helped in the repair of tools and buildings. By the age of 7 to 10, they were already fully involved in family life, performing hard work on a par with adults. Discipline was severe, and physical punishment was the norm, because it was believed that only in this way can you raise a persistent and submissive worker who can withstand all the hardships of peasant life. Children were beaten with rods, belts, forced to kneel in a corner, or deprived of food for the slightest offense or disobedience. Parents did not see this as cruelty, but only a necessary method of education to instill in children hard work, obedience, and respect for their elders. Emotional attachments may have existed, but they were suppressed by the constant struggle to survive. There were no schools for peasant children, with the possible exception of very rare monastic schools for boys. But there were still a few. Literacy was extremely rare. Most of the peasants were illiterate, unable to read or write. Knowledge was passed down orally from generation to generation. Folk signs, agricultural skills, legends, songs, and religious dogmas. Books were a luxury and a rarity, and the ability to read and write was considered a privilege of the clergy and nobility. This lack of education condemned the peasants to continue the cycle of ignorance and superstition, making them even more vulnerable to disease and exploitation. Children lived in conditions of constant danger, from hunger, disease, accidents at work, as well as from attacks by wild animals or robbers. Their childhood was short and full of hardships, and it ended as soon as it began, giving way to endless work and the struggle for survival. Traveling in winter was not just an inconvenience, but a real feat associated with the risk of life. The roads, if they could be called that at all, were an impassable mess of mud, deep snow, and ice. They were rarely paved, and even in dry weather, they were bumpy and dusty. In winter, they became a trap for travelers. Moving through them was extremely slow and dangerous. In the dense, dark forest Podstergali, hungry wolves lay in wait, which in winter became especially aggressive due to lack of food. Other wild animals, such as bears, were also dangerous. But what was even more terrible, gangs of robbers were operating on the road Shaiki Razboynikov, who, taking advantage of the desolation and poor visibility, attacked travelers, robbed them, and sometimes killed them. The lack of any transport there, then donkeys, mules, or one's own emaciated legs made every trip to a nearby village or town an incredibly long and dangerous undertaking. If the distance was more than a few kilometers, such a trip could take a whole day, or even several days, requiring overnight stays in abandoned huts or inns, which were also not always safe. Farmers rarely left their village, and for many the neighboring village was the end of the world. Shopping was a rare event, mostly at local markets, which were extremely poor in winter due to adverse weather conditions and a lack of sufficient goods. Snow and ice made it difficult to deliver food, and the range was extremely poor. Most of the necessities of the farm, such as salt, vital for preserving food and health, needles, thread, spices, available to only a few, knives, and other metal products were brought by traveling merchants and peddlers. Lonely, desperate daredevils who carried their wares on their backs or in large boxes. These merchants were not just sellers, but also the only window into a strange, distant world. They brought news, rumors, and gossip from other regions, telling of events in the cities, wars and kings, new fashions and discoveries that reached the peasant villages with great delay, if at all. They were a walking newspaper and a radio station at the same time. In addition to legal goods, they often sold contraband, for example, tobacco or alcohol, if this was prohibited, or dubious fakes, passing off cheap products for valuable ones. taking advantage of the naivety and lack of education of the peasants. These merchants were real heroes and criminals at the same time, and to meet them in a remote village in winter was a miracle and a real event, breaking the monotony of peasant life, bringing at least some novelty and hope to their hopeless existence. For the peasants, their arrival was like a breath of fresh air, an opportunity to learn something new and acquire what they could not produce themselves. Winter for the medieval English peasant was not just a season, but a ruthless, harsh test of survival that only a few could pass. Their lives were filled with hopeless hardships, constant fear, grueling work, and the struggle with invisible enemies, hunger, cold, and disease. But it was this struggle, this daily battle with the elements and the unpredictable fate, that made them incredibly resilient, inventive, and united, teaching them to appreciate every piece of bread and every minute of warmth. They were masters of survival, whose lessons are still relevant today, reminding us how fragile our comfort zone can be. If these shocking and poignant facts made you take a fresh look at your own life, reevaluate the incredible benefits that we are so used to, and feel grateful for every day that you spend in warmth, satiety, and safety, then be sure to subscribe to our channel and put a like. We will continue to reveal the darkest, most surprising, and sometimes frightening secrets of the past, which will make you think about the present and perhaps even about the future.